So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. As you will have gathered from the title, most of my work relates to bringing Hong Kong's wildlife trade to light. So that's looking at the legal trade and the illegal trade. But what I'm going to try and impress upon you today is why Hong Kong matters, and some of the work that we're doing to try and resolve that impact on global biodiversity. So first and foremost, why Hong Kong? Then I'll touch on how we're actually engaging and how we've done so since at least 2015. Some of the successes, some of our current work, and then a few reflections from the presentation. So first and foremost, Hong Kong is a bottleneck for the wildlife trade. We have tremendous amounts of trade of all manner coming through our city, but we are particularly acute in the context of the wildlife trade, and I'll give you a few numbers in a second to contextualize that. But why are we so big? Fundamentally, we are a tremendously important seaport. We used to be the largest seaport on the planet. We've since declined to 9th, but that is by no means a small volume. We are the largest air cargo port, and we have a tremendous number of people coming in and out of the city, with obviously 300 million passenger journeys just as of 2019, which is probably the last representative year for the scale of people moving through our city. So, the trade, what does that look like? First, I probably need to give you a little bit of an intro. If you're not familiar with CITES, it's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And so that matters in Hong Kong because a lot of the data and the insights that we get into how endangered species are being traded into, through, and beyond our city are governed under CITES. And these are obviously species that are particularly acutely threatened by unsustainable and uncontrolled, unfettered trade. That's not to say that once they come under the sort of the protections or at least the controls that CITES implements, it doesn't mean that they're sort of clear of all concerns, but at least we get some insights from this control. So to give you a sense of the scale, so looking from 2015 to 2021, we know that at least 24,467 metric tons of wildlife products were traded into the city, and that's just what was measured explicitly in kilograms. We've also had tens of millions of live animals and individual pieces of products. To give you a sense of where we rank globally, if you tease Hong Kong out, you can actually see that by products that are measured in kilograms, we are the third largest importer on the planet. We follow mainland China and Germany. We are larger than the United States. We're larger than Vietnam. We're larger than Japan, which is ridiculous when you consider that we are a tiny city that only has a population of about 7.5 million people. So we're really punching well above our weight. And to give you some context for what that really means, what are the animals that are actually being involved in this trade? Some of the species that we see coming through our city are huge quantities of crocodilian meat, so reptile meats of all kinds as well. So cobra, monitor lizard, crocodile, alligator, we dominate them all. We are tremendously important in the context of the reptile skin and leather trade. We're also the leading importer of mammal-derived medicines. And so that matters for species like the saiga, for the bear, for the brown bear, and we see these things in our shops all the time. So we're kind of desensitized to sort of the magnitude of that trade, what that means to the ecosystems that these animals are being harvested from. And then, as I think will come as no surprise to anybody, we are the world's largest importer of shark fins, with dominating 61% of the global trade. But I think of particular importance to this community is sort of our role and responsibility in the trade of live animals. So under CITES, the trade in live reptiles, birds, amphibians, and mammals, we dominate. We are number one, and we have been for at least a decade or more. And so why does that matter? Because we are the leading importer in the world of live reptiles. And that's something that hasn't really been sort of reckoned with, I think, locally. So there's a lot of challenges that we see in the local regulation. But I think it's very clear that when you dominate a trade to this extent, you have an overdue sense of responsibility to actually ensure that the trade that is flowing through your city is regulated properly, that it comprises safe, sustainable species that are cared for, that we have traceability and better understanding of. And I'll touch on why that's not really happening. I was going to touch on some concerns, but I think probably we're all very familiar with the pet trade, the issues around it. But for us, we look at everything from conservation, the welfare and the husbandry considerations, the controls in the trade, how pet owners are looking after their animals or not. And we also look at the health considerations, the biosecurity protocols. So we touch on all of this work and obviously the profusion of illegal trade and how that intersects with the legal trade. But I haven't really got time to delve into that. But those are the kind of areas that we do work on. So our approach, it's pretty straightforward. First and foremost, we wanted to understand what does the scale of the trade look like, what is the nature of that trade, and then what are the potential intervention points. So some of the reports that we've done that have really specifically looked on the trade, were focused on the illegal wildlife trade, and then we realized through that, the insights gleaned through the illegal wildlife trade was we didn't really understand what was happening with many facets of the legal trade. Some really great work has been done on the legislation by the likes of Amanda Whitford and Fiona Woodhouse, who's at the back. And so we really, are standing on the shoulders of giants and just trying to add to that body of understanding and data and also painting a picture with what the regulatory environment looks like and trying to sort of combine all of that information into a single document and then advocate based on that. So using the information and the insights that we've gleaned through that research, we've done a lot of policy engagement in the form of conducting surveys, white papers, position papers, and harassing the government through letters. I email the government absolutely every week, multiple times, so they know my name very well. But I think that persistence is really essential to, just getting them into the rhythm of answering your questions, getting them used to being subject to observation and monitoring is really critical. So we've also tried to find mechanisms and bodies within the legislative sort of framework and within the government where there are points of intervention. So credit to the government for actually having an initiative like the Interdepartmental Task Force on Wildlife Crime. It has the customs agencies, it has the conservation guys, and it has the police. Unfortunately, most of the time it manifests as purely a talk shop. So we do a lot of work trying to bring together all of the different voices so that, one, we can unify our voices through initiatives like the Hong Kong Wildlife Trade Working Group, which, whilst it sounds like we're pro-trade, we're not super pro-trade. But we're trying to find sort of productive, conducive ways to work together between the organizations and with academics, but also to unify our voice so that when we go to the government, we're not all clamoring for like slight variations on a call to action, that we're really clear and unified on that front. We also do a lot of media engagement, as you all do, so our work has been covered extensively. And also trying to engage the public. So, I mean, this is not necessarily the area where we really dominate, but something that we do try and do is gain visibility on these issues, work with partners who can actually leverage our voice. So at the moment, we have a collaboration with WWF, and we'll also be bringing in as many members of the Wildlife Trade Working Group as we possibly can to sort of leverage the information that we've gleaned on Hong Kong's pet trade to basically cause a fuss, to get them to understand that this is a crisis, that it's kind of been long sort of hidden within the archives, and bring it to light. So some of the successes, and again, I wouldn't claim that ADM Capital Foundation is the only organization that's led to these successes. But we've all of the community in Hong Kong, every NGO, so many academics have played a really critical role in actually driving really positive reforms. So in 2018, there was the ivory ban, and that was accompanied by increases in the penalties for CITES-related wildlife crimes. So that was really essential for providing sort of, one, that rhetorical victory that we could actually talk about wildlife crime as being a serious crime. We had more severe penalties that could be issued to wildlife criminals when they were caught. And obviously it meant the closure of the ivory markets in Hong Kong, which finally closed, I think, 5 years after that. And then another initiative that's been really critical in Hong Kong, and as you can see, Amanda is in that photo, but working with legislators, academics, and NGOs to really push for wildlife crime to be designated as an organized and serious crime. And so that, again, is another really significant sort of shift. Again, a really important rhetorical battle because, now the government has categorically stated that they acknowledge that wildlife crime is an organized and serious crime, which means that you can bring to bear a whole host of sort of investigative powers. You can freeze assets, you can bring the police in. There's all these avenues that have opened up by sort of having this reform. The challenge that we have now is whether they're actually using that. So, you win one battle, you have to fight the next. So, as I said, I think one of the pieces of work that we're involved in at the moment that's of particular pertinence to this group is the exotic pet trade. So in 2021, we published our report, Hong Kong's Invisible Pets, Wild Threatened Farmed Hong Kong's Invisible Pets, which was really trying to get a handle on the scale of that trade, because up to that point, we didn't really have sort of an up-to-date sense of the scale, the diversity of species, and the potential concerns around that. So what we learned was that obviously we could see from the CITES data that we were a really important importer of reptiles, but what we didn't have a good sense of was beyond CITES. What does that look like? What is the fuller context and composition of our trade? What we could find through data requests to the Agriculture, Fisheries and Conservation Department, the AFCD, was that we could account for approximately 5.2 million live exotic animals going to licensed animal traders. And now it's not to say that absolutely every single one of them went into the exotic pet trade, but to the extent where we could determine their end uses, we believe that most of those species were quite likely, to some extent, being used by the exotic pet trade. And this doesn't include a whole host of other species that are imported explicitly for things like food, which are many millions more, tens of millions more. So delving into the data, what we could actually see was that at least 3.5 million of these animals were regulated under CITES and accounted for about 250 species, so very diverse. But what was really concerning was you had this other 1.7 million, which was twice as diverse. And one of the challenges that we have in the regulation of the non-CITES species is that many of these taxa sort of have very differentiated, siloed regulations. So when you're talking about CITES, arthropods, and amphibians, we have some data. But when it comes to non-CITES invertebrates and amphibians, they completely drop off the radar. So we have no sense, really, of the import volumes, particularly of arthropods, insects, and other species like that. So that's a real challenge. And then there's also issues around how they are regulated and managed when they are in the local trade. So CITES is great because it provides us with at least some sort of mechanism for the oversight of the trade. There are controls. You have to have a possession license for many of these species, particularly when they're traded live, and especially if they're sourced from the wild. But one of the challenges that we have is that there isn't really any mechanism governing how these animals are sort of kept, particularly for the so for non-CITES arthropods or insects, for example, there's basically no licensing required. You don't have to declare any numbers. For the amphibians, there's absolutely zero guidance on sort of the husbandry and care that you need to provide, and not to mention, and beyond that, sort of no real oversight and checking on what's happening in the shops. So that just gives you a sense of sort of the ups and downs of the trade in recent years. But as you can see, in 2016, we had over 1 million animals arriving in the city. Again, we're a city of 7.5 million. So with these numbers, I mean, assuming that every animal, is still alive, potentially that means that we've got 2 per household in the city. But that's just not realistically happening. So then this raises the question of what's actually happening with these species. So, sorry, I've given you a little bit of a sneak preview of the 2022 data, but spoiler, it's pretty much, similar disparity. But one of the challenges that we have is that we see millions coming into the city, and based on the data, we can only account for hundreds of thousands leaving it. So that begs the question, what the hell is happening to these species? What's happening to these individuals? And so we've got at least 3.4 million animals that have come into the city, and we basically have no accountability for them. There's no traceability. We do not know what their fates are. They could have been imported by the animal trader, and then once they're sold, they could be in food. They could be residing happily and healthily in somebody's home, but we don't have evidence that they're that well distributed, because the last time we did a domestic household survey was 2005. So we're really out of date, and the scale of the trade has really ballooned. The other likely scenario, if you know anything about Hong Kong and mainland China, is that they're being trafficked. So probably a very large number of these animals are being trafficked through our city. But the unfortunate reality is we have zero understanding of exactly what the true fates of these animals are. We have suspicions, of course, we have insights from other jurisdictions, but the challenge that we have is that we can't actually answer the question of what happened to those animals, and nor can the government, because I ask them very regularly, and they don't know either. And that means that we're basically failing to meet the commitments under CITES, to ensure that this trade is conducted in a safe, sustainable, suitable manner, to ensure that we aren't impinging on the long-term survival of so many of these species. The fact that we can't answer even the basic questions of what happened, how many died in transit, how many died in the shop, how many are living healthy, happy lives. The fact that we do not know that is a severe failure in my view. Now, I've got a real passion for these guys. This is the yellow-spotted river turtle. And the reason that I care about them is because they are really dominant in our trade. You may not know this species. I had no idea until we started looking into this in 2021. But essentially, it's a vulnerable species. It hasn't been assessed by the IUCN since 1996. But this species is ranched. And I think I've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to explain what ranched means in the context of CITES. Basically, that's an animal that's taken from the wild as an egg or a hatchling, purportedly because it would not have survived in the wild. Perfect. So the reality of that means that there's sort of this system which allows for a little bit of kind of laundering, where basically the animals are taken from the wild, they're put into a facility, ranched, grown out, and then they are traded to the next jurisdiction. And it gives this veneer, this perception that these animals are captive bred, that they're captive reared. But the reality is they're sourced exclusively from the wild. That's the definition of ranched. It has to come from the wild. So you can't really argue that these animals are captive bred, that they're captive reared. But the challenge that we have in Hong Kong is that the way that they're regulated is as if they are captive bred. So it's a massive problem that we're seeing, and as a result, they're really exempted from a lot of the controls that they really need to be, governed under. And as you can see, they are really a poster child of that disparity between the import and the export data. Sorry, the big yellow bar is the imports, the tiny little brownish bar is the re-exports. So we just have no idea. I mean, the disparity between those two numbers is vast, and when we just don't know. We don't know what happened with those animals, and there aren't 2 million. There aren't 2 million animals of this species sort of just swanning around in Hong Kong. We know that they're going somewhere, but we're really failing this species by not knowing where. And that really matters because this species also just happens to be the most heavily trafficked species on the planet, and Hong Kong inevitably is playing a role in allowing that to continue. And just for context, I mean, the largest seizure in Hong Kong's history of live exotic animals comprised nearly 12,000 individuals of this species that were being trafficked out of Hong Kong on a speedboat. So that we know there is sort of this history, this precedent of these species being trafficked out of the city, and obviously in the global context. So this is from the UNODC. We know that they're being seized all around the world, and so as the world's largest importer of this species, we have an overdue responsibility to just do better. So a few reflections from our work. I think Hong Kong, hopefully you're convinced now, but Hong Kong's role in the global wildlife trade is huge and often overlooked. But we're working to shed more light on it and convince everybody that we need to do more, we need to build more knowledge. The way that we've sort of built our work is really building it on a really solid foundation of knowledge. So understanding the trade data, understanding the composition, understanding the conservation concerns, the husbandry concerns, the welfare concerns, and then also understanding the legislative landscape, the regulations, and working with lawyers, working with academics, working with the government on a regular basis. I mean, in the formation of our Wild Threatened Farmed Hong Kong's Invisible Pets report, I corresponded with the government at least 150 times to just get answers to very basic questions like, do you have slaughter codes for amphibians? How many birds have died in trader premises? The answer is no and no. We have none of that data, we have no oversight. But I think really engaging with the government and constantly hampering them is really essential. I mean, as advocates yourselves, you'll know that that's pretty much the only way you can get it. It's a multi-year engagement. You have to sustain that pressure. But eventually, they do start to respond to the emails. You'll find somebody who will know the answer, will be willing to give it to you, or will just want to shut you up. So they'll give you a response. So at least it's worked for me. And so I think data is really key. You need to be credible. So I think representing the data accurately, talking about the flaws, what you do know, what you don't know, all of that is really essential in your advocacy and your campaign work. Champions are really essential. I mean, I didn't really mention it, but in getting the Organised and Serious Crimes Ordinance reforms, we work with a legislator. And I know from the work that's been done by AWARE in South Korea, they've done some really great work engaging with the lawmakers. I know SPCA Taiwan has done really great work with legislators, and I think that's really key. Finding those champions, finding those star people who will actually drive that reform is really essential. Timing, also really key, but I mean that's case by case. Having the right team, learning from other jurisdictions. I mean, I've learned a huge amount. Again, Taiwan, South Korea, I've seen really great work that's being done in all of those jurisdictions, a lot of lessons that we want to bring into our work, and hopefully a few ideas from the work we've done, and really leveraging your local resources. I mean, Hong Kong, we're really lucky. We've got a tremendous number of academics, really passionate advocates. We're also sort of at the hub of all of these other countries that bring their knowledge, come to conferences, and we can obviously go to many others. And I think just leveraging that sort of community voice, that community knowledge is really essential. So always reach out, always try and draw the community in, and try and learn from as many people as you possibly can. So thank you. Do I have time for questions? Oh, sure. Mm.
Is the opposition of the industry?
Mm.
How are you dealing with it? Because that's the problem that we're having.
Yeah.
Now the industry has been expanded to on ignorable level.
Yeah.
And then they're actually working as pressure groups
Mm.
to government lawmakers.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. In terms of the advocacy side of things, I mean, in Hong Kong for the pet trade, we know that there's approximately 170 traders who probably deal with exotics. They haven't yet cottoned on to the fact that they're at risk, I don't think. They're probably peripherally aware of it, but I don't think they feel the pressure, unlike the ivory trade. So the ivory campaign work was very fractious in Hong Kong, and similarly with the shark fin trade. I think there are industries that have already been under fire for a very long time. They know what the risks are to their business long term. Luckily, with the exotic pet trade, I don't think they're quite there yet. In terms of how they were countered, I think there was actually a really good approach by the Hong Kong government when they decided that they wanted to commit to the ivory ban. In terms of defanging the industry, what they did was they did a public consultation. So they reached out to everybody in the trade and they said, okay, so what percentage of your trade is still ivory from elephants? And the wonderful thing is, all of them lied. They basically said, oh, no, we're very conservation minded. We're very aware of the plight of the elephant, and it's a very small part of our business now. So the wonderful thing about that admission or that claim was that basically it meant that the government could say, well, okay, it's not going to actually hamper your business if we shut down the market then. If it's 2% of your business, you can't really turn around and claim that you need compensation when we abolish that market. And I think sort of finding those sneaky little routes and finding ways to get sort of those rhetorical battles is really critical. You just need them on record saying, oh yeah, we believe in conservation. And people want to do that because that's the popular view. That's sort of the way the winds are blowing. And I think if you can get people in trade to make those little concessions, and just over time, little small sound bites here and there, eventually you can sort of twist them against them, or at least hold them to account based on what they said before. I kind of worked in that context. Thank you. Cool.